The year was 1162, and across the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a child was born who would reshape the very fabric of human civilization through conquest, terror, and appetites that defied comprehension. His name was Temujin, though history would remember him by a title that still sends shivers through the collective memory of humanity: Genghis Khan. But beneath the legend of military genius and empire building lies a darker truth, one that medieval chroniclers whispered about in hushed tones and modern historians have largely sanitized for popular consumption. What we're about to explore isn't the sanitized version of Mongol expansion found in textbooks. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of a man whose sexual practices were so extreme, so systematically brutal, that they became weapons of psychological warfare as potent as any sword or arrow. The great Khan didn't simply conquer territories, he conquered the very concept of human dignity through methods that would make even the most hardened medieval warriors recoil in horror. Contemporary sources, from Persian chroniclers to Chinese court records, paint a picture of sexual violence so comprehensive and calculated that it fundamentally altered the genetic landscape of Asia. Modern DNA studies suggest that nearly 16 million men alive today carry genetic markers tracing back to Genghis Khan's lineage, but these numbers, staggering as they are, only hint at the true scope of what transpired across the Mongol Empire during the 13th century. The traditional narrative focuses on Khan's military innovations, his meritocratic approach to leadership, and his religious tolerance. These accounts, while factually accurate, deliberately obscure the systematic sexual terrorism that accompanied every Mongol conquest. What emerges from careful examination of primary sources is a portrait of a ruler who weaponized human sexuality in ways that had never been conceived before and, mercifully, have rarely been replicated since. To understand the full horror of Genghis Khan's sexual practices, we must first examine the world that produced them. The Mongol steppes of the 12th century were a harsh environment where survival depended on strength, cunning, and an absolute willingness to destroy anyone who posed a threat. Tribal warfare was constant, brutal, and total. Victory meant not just defeating enemies, but eliminating their capacity to ever threaten you again. In this context, the systematic rape and sexual humiliation of conquered peoples served multiple strategic purposes that Khan elevated to an art form. The young Temujin experienced firsthand the sexual violence that permeated steppe culture when rival tribes captured his wife Berta shortly after their marriage. The months she spent in captivity, during which she was repeatedly assaulted, fundamentally shaped Khan's understanding of sexual violence as both personal trauma and political weapon. When he eventually rescued her, she was pregnant with a child whose paternity would forever remain uncertain. This experience didn't inspire compassion or a desire to protect others from similar suffering. Instead, it taught him that sexual domination was the ultimate expression of power over one's enemies. Contemporary accounts describe how Khan systematized what had previously been the chaotic sexual violence typical of nomadic raids. Under his leadership, the Mongol military developed protocols for the treatment of conquered women that were both methodical and psychologically devastating. These weren't random acts of brutality committed by undisciplined soldiers, but carefully orchestrated campaigns of sexual terror designed to break the will of entire populations. The Khan's personal harem became legendary even among his contemporaries, not for its size alone, but for the deliberate psychological cruelty with which it was assembled. Unlike traditional harems that might include willing concubines or political marriages, Khan's collection consisted almost entirely of women taken by force from conquered territories. Court records suggest he maintained detailed knowledge of each woman's background, including which cities they came from and which family members had been killed during their capture. This information wasn't mere record-keeping, it was psychological ammunition used to maximize their suffering. Persian chronicler Juvayni described encounters with survivors who spoke of Khan's practice of forcing captured women to watch the execution of their male relatives before being taken to his tent. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but a calculated method of breaking psychological resistance. A woman who had witnessed the brutal death of her father, brothers, or husband was less likely to attempt escape or resist future assaults. The trauma became a form of psychological imprisonment more effective than physical restraints. The Khan's sexual appetite extended far beyond personal gratification. He understood that his treatment of conquered women would be reported throughout the territories he planned to invade, creating a climate of terror that preceded his armies. Cities would surrender without fighting rather than subject their female populations to the horrors that awaited them if they resisted. This psychological warfare proved so effective that some historians argue it was more responsible for Mongol territorial expansion than their military innovations. But perhaps most disturbing was Khan's practice of what contemporary sources called ceremonial violation, elaborate rituals of sexual humiliation performed in full view of surviving male prisoners. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the complete powerlessness of conquered men to protect their women. They provided entertainment for Mongol warriors, and they created lasting trauma that would suppress future resistance. The psychological impact of witnessing such scenes often proved more devastating to survivors than physical torture. The systematic nature of these practices becomes clear when examining Mongol military organization. Each unit was assigned specific quotas of women to capture during conquests, with different ranks entitled to different selections from the spoils. The Khan himself claimed first choice from among the most beautiful or highest-ranking captives, but even common soldiers were guaranteed access to sexual slaves as part of their compensation. This institutionalization of sexual violence created powerful incentives for aggressive expansion and ensured that every Mongol warrior had personal investment in the continuation of conquest. Contemporary Chinese sources describe the terror that preceded Mongol advances, with entire populations fleeing their homes rather than face capture. Those too old, young, or infirm to escape often chose suicide over the alternative. Archaeological evidence from sites across Central Asia reveals mass graves containing predominantly female remains, suggesting that many women killed themselves rather than endure what awaited them under Mongol rule. The Khan's reputation had become so fearsome that death seemed preferable to survival. The scale of sexual violence during Mongol conquests defies modern comprehension. When Khan's forces captured the city of Nishapur in 1221, contemporary accounts suggest that virtually every woman in the city was subjected to systematic assault over a period of weeks. The population, once numbering over 100,000, was so thoroughly traumatized that the city never fully recovered. Similar patterns repeated across dozens of major population centers throughout Asia and Eastern Europe. What made Khan's practices particularly terrifying was their systematic progression. Each conquest built upon lessons learned from previous campaigns, refining methods of psychological and sexual warfare to maximum effectiveness. By the time Mongol forces reached Europe, their reputation preceded them so completely that some cities surrendered immediately upon seeing the approaching army, hoping that submission might spare their populations from the worst excesses. The Khan's personal involvement in these practices extended beyond mere oversight. Multiple sources describe his habit of personally selecting and assaulting the wives and daughters of defeated rulers, often in front of the men he had conquered. This wasn't simple sadism, but calculated humiliation designed to demonstrate the complete reversal of power structures. Former kings and nobles, stripped of everything that had once defined their identity, were forced to witness the systematic degradation of everything they had once sworn to protect. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual acts of violence to encompass entire cultural systems. Khan understood that destroying a people's sense of identity required more than killing their warriors or burning their cities. He needed to corrupt their most sacred institutions, and nothing was more sacred across the civilizations he encountered than the bonds between families and the protection of women and children. Contemporary accounts from the secret history of the Mongols reveal how Khan deliberately targeted religious and cultural leaders' families for the most extreme treatment. When Buddhist monasteries fell under Mongol control, the nuns faced particularly horrific fates designed not just to satisfy his warriors' appetites but to desecrate the spiritual foundations of conquered societies. The violation of women who had devoted their lives to celibacy and spiritual purity sent shockwaves through Buddhist communities that reverberated for generations. Islamic chroniclers documented similar patterns when Mongol forces swept through the great cities of the Khwarezmian Empire. The systematic assault on women from prominent religious families wasn't merely opportunistic violence, but a deliberate strategy to undermine the moral authority of surviving Islamic leaders. How could an imam counsel his community about divine protection when his own daughter had been subjected to such degradation before his eyes? The Khan's methods evolved to incorporate elements of psychological torture that modern warfare has rarely matched in their calculated cruelty. Captured women were often forced to write letters to their families in unconquered territories, describing in graphic detail the treatment they could expect if they continued to resist Mongol advances. These letters, delivered by Mongol messengers, proved devastatingly effective at breaking the will of defenders who had never seen a Mongol warrior but could vividly imagine the fate awaiting their loved ones. The logistics of managing such extensive sexual violence required sophisticated administrative systems that the Mongols developed with characteristic efficiency. Court records describe detailed catalogues maintained of captured women, organized by age, appearance, social status, and the specific circumstances of their capture. This wasn't mere record-keeping, but a systematic approach to maximizing psychological impact. Women from the same family or community were often separated and distributed across different military units, ensuring that survivors could never find comfort in familiar company. The Khan's personal quarters became a theatre of calculated horror, where the daughters and wives of conquered rulers were subjected to ritualized humiliation designed to break not just their spirits, but their very sense of identity. Persian sources describe elaborate ceremonies where these women were forced to serve at feasts, celebrating the destruction of their homelands, wearing the jewelry and clothing of their murdered relatives, while Mongol warriors recounted the details of how their families had died. But perhaps most disturbing was Khan's practice of psychological manipulation that extended far beyond physical violation. He understood that the human mind's capacity for hope could be weaponized as effectively as fear. Captured women were sometimes told that their compliance and submission might spare other family members who were supposedly being held elsewhere. These false promises created agonizing moral dilemmas where victims became complicit in their own degradation, believing they were making noble sacrifices to protect others. The systematic nature of these deceptions reveals the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that Khan brought to his campaigns of terror. Women who discovered they had endured months or years of abuse for nothing experienced psychological breaks so complete that contemporary observers struggled to find adequate language to describe their condition. The betrayal of hope proved even more devastating than the initial trauma of capture. The genetic legacy of Khan's systematic sexual violence becomes even more chilling when viewed through the lens of modern DNA analysis. The 16 million descendants carrying his genetic markers represent not consensual relationships, but the biological evidence of history's most extensive campaign of sexual terrorism. Each of those genetic lineages traces back to acts of violence that shattered individual lives and entire communities across the medieval world. The Khan's understanding of generational trauma was remarkably sophisticated for his era. He recognized that children born from these assaults would carry psychological scars that could destabilize societies for decades. These children, neither fully accepted by their mothers' communities nor acknowledged by their Mongol fathers, became living reminders of conquest and humiliation. Many grew up in environments where their very existence symbolized their community's defeat and degradation. Contemporary sources describe how Khan deliberately encouraged his warriors to father children with captured women from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. This wasn't mere reproductive opportunism, but a calculated strategy to create populations with divided loyalties and confused identities. Children who carried Mongol blood but grew up in conquered territories often faced impossible choices between embracing their heritage and rejecting their communities, or vice versa. The psychological impact on these children extended beyond personal identity crises to encompass fundamental questions about human nature and morality. Growing up hearing whispered stories about their conception while seeing their mother's ongoing trauma created generations of individuals struggling with profound questions about justice, revenge, and forgiveness. Some channeled their rage into becoming exceptionally cruel warriors themselves, while others retreated into isolation or religious extremism. The Khan's methods for breaking the spirits of captured women evolved throughout his campaigns, incorporating lessons learned from observing which techniques proved most effective at destroying resistance. Early in his conquests, physical brutality was often sufficient to achieve submission, but as his reputation spread and women began arriving already traumatized by their expectations of what awaited them, he developed more sophisticated approaches that targeted their psychological vulnerabilities rather than relying solely on physical pain. One particularly insidious practice involved forcing captured women to participate in the planning of attacks on their own communities. Those who provided useful intelligence about defensive weaknesses or the locations of hidden valuables were rewarded with marginally better treatment, creating a system where survival required active betrayal of everything they had once held dear. The guilt and self-loathing that resulted from these collaborations often proved more destructive to their sense of self than the initial sexual violence. The social dynamics within Khan's expanding collection of captives became a microcosm of the broader psychological warfare he waged against conquered populations. Women from different cultures and social backgrounds were deliberately housed together, creating environments where traditional support systems couldn't function. A Khwarezmian noblewoman might find herself sharing quarters with Chinese peasants and Russian merchants' wives, each group bringing different languages, customs, and coping mechanisms that often proved incompatible. These enforced multicultural environments weren't accidental but carefully designed to prevent the formation of resistance networks or mutual support systems. Women who might have found strength in shared cultural identity or common social backgrounds instead found themselves isolated by differences that the Khan's administrators deliberately emphasized and exploited. The legacy of Genghis Khan's systematic sexual terrorism extends far beyond the medieval world into our contemporary understanding of warfare, power, and human cruelty. His methods established templates for psychological warfare that would echo through history, from the Ottoman campaigns in Europe to the systematic rape camps of modern conflicts. The Khan understood what many military strategists have since learned, that breaking a population's will requires attacking not just their bodies, but their fundamental sense of human dignity and cultural identity. What makes Khan's practices particularly haunting is their calculated efficiency. This wasn't the chaotic brutality of undisciplined armies, but the methodical application of terror as statecraft. Every act of sexual violence served multiple strategic purposes. Every humiliation was designed to maximize psychological impact. Every ritual of degradation contributed to a comprehensive system of domination that conquered minds as thoroughly as it conquered territories. The silence that has surrounded these aspects of Mongol conquest in popular historical narratives speaks to our collective discomfort with confronting the true depths of human cruelty. We prefer our historical monsters to be cartoonish villains rather than calculating strategists who understood how to weaponize our most intimate vulnerabilities. But understanding the full scope of Khan's methods reminds us that civilization's veneer remains terrifyingly thin, and that the capacity for systematic cruelty lurks within institutions that claim to represent order and progress.